everybody for being here. As you know, we're here to mark the second year since Marvin Henry's wrongful handcuffing right there outside the Starbucks. And so I'm going to invite Reverend Katie to get us started with some opening words.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for braving the Omicron surge and for braving this sort of typical New England January morning to gather in support of Marvin Henry and broader reform and accountability in our town. I'm honored that Equal Justice in Needham asked me and my colleague, Rabbi Julie, to open and close this gathering today. I look forward to following the lead of our town's young people as we consider what our future actions might be. I know we are gathered here as compassionate and justice-minded Needhamites and neighbors of many faiths and of no faith at all. I ask you to join me in a brief time of reflection, meditation, and prayer as we center ourselves on this present moment and the difficult anniversary of Marvin Henry's wrongful handcuffing. Also, these gloves are really causing me trouble. Please join me in this spirit. Spirit of life, God understood by many names, the love greater than all of us that sustains us for the hard work ahead to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. Spirit of life and love, we are gathered here today in solemn recognition and fierce outrage at the second anniversary of the wrongful handcuffing of our neighbor, Mr. Marvin Henry. We weep for every microaggression, indignity, abuse, and violence that BIPOC Americans disproportionately experience, especially when such prejudice comes from our own government officials and employees. We mourn with all those who have lost a loved one to police brutality, as we are people who believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and so we remember their names: Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, John Crawford, Tanisha Anderson, Eric Garner, Botham Jean, Rikia Boyd, Philando Castile, Dante Wright, so many others. We pray for accountability and restitution for all these lost loved ones. We're grateful for every person who has come here today and all those who have supported Mr. Henry throughout this long ordeal. We're grateful for every person who proudly and loudly proclaims that Black Lives Matter and recognizes that in our country, those of marginalized racial and ethnic identities do not receive fair treatment or equal opportunities to white Americans. We're grateful for every person who is in the work for systemic change in our local Greater Boston community and across our fractured and soul-sick nation. Spirit of life, we ask as one united body of diverse people for the courage to continue in our advocacy for local and national reform and accountability in our law enforcement, legal system, and social safety net. The fight for racial equity has gone on for centuries, and we carry on the flame of equality and justice within and among us. May our commitment to this long-haul work stay strong, and may we inspire others, especially our elected officials and public servants, to join us. Blessed be, and amen.
Thank you, Reverend Katie. My name is Smriti Rao, and I'm a contributor to Equal Justice in Needham's Public Safety Working Group. I am again here to remind everybody a little bit about the events that have led us to this point. As we know, Mr. Marvin Henry was wrongfully handcuffed outside that Starbucks around 3:15 about 2 years ago. And, slowly when he came forward in the summer of 2020, inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and the national outrage against the killing and murder of George Floyd, all of us, participated in those marches about Black Lives Mattering. That inspired him to come forward and report what had happened to him to the town, because until then he had not heard back from our Needham Police and was expecting any day a summons in the mail. And slowly, disturbing details about what happened to him on that day, but also what happened in the 3 days following, as the Needham Police Department tried to work really hard to prove him guilty in the face of overwhelming evidence that he was innocent. right? We learned about this not through the department's own internal affairs investigation, which basically concluded that there was no wrongdoing committed, but rather through an independent report our town had to pay for, which revealed multiple serious policy violations and also importantly stressed the concern the investigators felt around the attitude of no harm, no foul. I'm quoting from the report that they sort of encountered, which they felt pointed to a culture that minimized the seriousness of what happened to Mr. Henry and was dangerous in that, of course, without acknowledging what we have done wrong, we really cannot address and fix those problems completely. And so I think what Mr. Henry has always been asking for is that acknowledgement that wrong was done to him, that policies were violated, right? And therefore, the systemic reform that we need to address that larger culture can begin to take hold. So Mr. Henry has made it very clear that he is looking for that kind of systemic reform, and he has pointed out that his main goal is to ensure that this never happens to anyone else. And I think all of us gathered here today are sort of united in supporting him in that mission. His coming forward and filing a federal lawsuit against our town has initiated some small steps of progress. And we are all of us, I'm sure, are very happy and supportive of those steps. But we do want to also point out that other towns have gone way ahead of us, right here in Massachusetts. And what our town has not engaged in is any kind of bold systemic reform, right? We have extended training, we have done some other things, but that kind of systemic reform is what we're looking for now. And you will see in the materials a whole list of questions that we might want to ask our select board to sort of move us forward in that direction. We have 3 main proposals that, again, please take a look at. And I will just conclude by saying, you may also be aware that our town filed a legal reply to Mr. Henry's lawsuit. It is apparently authored by the insurance company, but unfortunately it takes our name. It says the town of Needham. And so when I read that, as a tax-paying resident of the town of Needham for the last 14 years, I thought to myself, not in my name. And so at least I am here to say that unlike our town's legal reply, I accept, and I am sad to accept that Mr. Henry's civil rights were indeed violated, that he did indeed suffer both physical and emotional harm, and that we do in fact need systemic reform in order to address the conditions that led to his wrongful handcuffing that day. And I want to just, stop there, and I will pass the mic on to Michelle Chalmers, who is a friend of Mr. Henry's.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Michelle Chalmers, she, her. I have recently moved from Wellesley, where I have lived for the past 13 years and raised my children, and where I was raised as a child. Thank you again for having me. I was the former president of the World of Wellesley, a sister organization to your Needham Diversity Initiative, headed by the beloved David Summergrad, may he rest in power, and my good friend Gretchen Cook Anderson and Rebecca and many other people. The World of Wellesley had been working with the Wellesley community for almost 3 years to cease to honor Columbus and instead honor our First Nations people with Indigenous Peoples Day. May I acknowledge that we are on the stolen and unceded land of the Massachusetts tribe and Nipmuc nations. It was a difficult week, and we were working with the select board and town meeting, and I remembered I had a gift certificate from Christmas to get a massage. And so I called and made an appointment, and that is where I met Mr. Henry. Marvin and I met as he gave me a massage, and I was sharing with him a little bit about some of the things that I had been working on. And he asked me, can I share something that happened to me? And I said, of course. And I listened to his story of what the trauma that happened to him right there. And you will hear more in the letter that I will read. He wept. And as he cried, he said, what did I do wrong? What is wrong with me? What did I do? I was wearing a nice sweater. Nothing is wrong with Marvin. And that is what I shared with him through our tears. Nothing is wrong with you, Mr. Henry. Nothing is wrong with Black people. What is wrong is white supremacy. What is wrong is the racism that it embeds in us and embeds in our systems, in our institutions, that we must change. I asked Mr. Henry if he wanted my help, and he said yes. So I left and immediately drove to my friend Gretchen's house and shared with her what had happened, what I had learned. And then she made contact with the civil rights attorneys that have been fighting for Mr. Henry's justice for over 2 years, or almost 2 years. I was not in the right place at the right time. Racism is everywhere, every day, all around us. And we must be open and aware and see and acknowledge and act. We cannot be afraid. And please do not be afraid of justice. The attorneys couldn't be here today, but they asked me to read this letter. Thank you for being here today. Your support and solidarity mean a great deal to Marvin Henry, a Black man who is raising 4 sons and working right here in Needham to support his family. 2 years ago this week, after a routine shopping trip to CVS, Mr. Henry was racially profiled and cornered by multiple Needham police officers. He was thrown up against the side of his car, handcuffed, and detained for almost 40 minutes on suspicion of shoplifting. Suspicions the town has since admitted are completely unfounded. All this happened in broad daylight, mere blocks from his place of employment. The Needham Police ignored Mr. Henry's terrified requests to loosen his handcuffs because his hands were in pain, or to explain to his job why he would be late. Instead, they told him to expect to be hauled into court. They told him he had been caught on camera shoplifting, but then refused to make the tapes or any other information available. In fact, Mr. Henry had been racially profiled. Even when Mr. Henry found attorneys to fight for him, the town posted misleading and inaccurate information on its website, suggesting Mr. Henry was some kind of serial criminal, when in fact, he was wholly innocent of any offense. Even when an independent investigator hired by the town concluded that Mr. Henry had been unconstitutionally pat-frisked and that the department's internal affairs investigation was solely deficient, Needham failed to make amends to Mr. Henry or institute meaningful policy or personnel reforms. The incident has caused Mr. Henry physical, emotional, and psychological harm. He was racially profiled and robbed of his dignity, his personhood, and his rights. As he sat in handcuffs, cornered by multiple officers, he knew that one whiff of aggression, one sign of resistance, risked leaving him like George Floyd, like Terrence Coleman, like Alton Sterling, like Philando Castile, like Michael Brown, dead or gravely injured. These are no small injuries. For too long, Black men and women have been forced to endure indignities at the hands of police. From supposedly random traffic stops to illegal handcuffings, simply because they allegedly fit the profile of a suspect. Enough is enough. This case is bigger than just Mr. Henry. It is an opportunity for the town of Needham to reckon with the systemic discrimination that pervades so many of our public institutions and to acknowledge that the kind of humiliation, terror, and indignity that Mr. Henry experienced is no longer an acceptable cost of being Black in Massachusetts. Mere days after the celebration of the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we applaud your efforts to hold the town accountable, to make Mr. Henry whole, and to institute lasting institutional policy changes to ensure no person is ever humiliated and robbed of bodily integrity simply because of the color of their skin.
I'm VJ. I'm a senior at Needham High School, and I am a part of the Social and Political Activism Club, and I'm also a member of Equal Justice in Needham. My activism club, along with the Black Student Union, are working on a letter to the Needham Police Department and the Needham Select Board, which I'm going to read some excerpts from now.
Great.
Dear Select Board and Police Department, Needham High School's Social and Political Activism Club has partnered with the Black Student Union to construct the following letter. The Black Student Union fosters a safe and productive environment for Black or African American students in discussions on issues in the Black community. The Social and Political Activism Club works on local reforms to advocate for a safe and equitable Needham. We, the students, consider the improvement of policing rules and regulations an issue of utmost importance. The school resource officers interact with students daily, and frequent police-student interactions occur outside of school. We have a communal obligation as members of this community to advocate for equality, fairness, and justice in all government institutions. We have immense respect for the challenging work that our officers do and the risks that they face in the pursuit of our safety. But we must also recognize the painful history of police brutality in our nation, and there is always room to grow. As leaders within the Needham High School community, we want to specifically emphasize the need for an oversight body that would work directly to combat racial inequities, enhance training in de-escalation, bias, and mental health, and maintain quality data collection. Many of these data-driven policies have not only been shown to reduce civilian injuries and fatalities, but also increase officer safety. These recommendations drew on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, which was composed of a variety of public health experts and police chiefs from across the nation, and rigorously gathered data from database policy recommendation organization Campaign Zero. The latter organization has consulted cities across the nation, improving use of force policies and union contracts. We hope that the Needham Police Department and Select Board will heed the advice of these qualified experts to ensure that we hold our department to the highest standards. The oversight body would enhance Needham Police Department policies and procedures. Current rules and regulations, for example, do not ensure sufficient high-quality guidelines for safe mental health interventions or guideposts for de-escalation of these situations involving a mental health crisis. The bottom line is that in order for the Needham Police Department procedures to be continuously effective, policies need to be revisited and recalibrated to reflect the latest data and policing standards. A dedicated civilian review board would do just that. Along with policies and procedures, this oversight body would address Needham Police Department training. Currently, training is focused on firearms and use of force, and a transition toward a focus on bias, de-escalation, mental health, domestic violence, and drug abuse, of which few are mandatory in the status quo, would improve the safety of not just our community, but of our police officers as well. A body like this has precedent. Other town institutions, such as the Needham Public Schools, have civilian oversight bodies composed of elected representatives with tangible power. They act as a check against school officials or teachers who fail to perform their duties and act against the betterment of our students. A similar board for law enforcement is one step closer to making our police accountable to the people and ensuring a more just community. Increasing community involvement in our police procedures through an elected committee would also increase trust and communication between Needhamites and the police. We appreciate and recognize the vital work that the Needham Police Department conducts every day to ensure the safety and well-being of the Needham community. Nevertheless, we also bring the light to the fact that our department can and should not just adhere to, but also surpass current statewide regulations and policies to ensure that every Needhamite feels at home in this town. As communities nationwide begin to institute reforms, it's more important than ever to look upon our neighbors and emulate their formulas for success. Thank you. Signed by the Social and Political Activism Club and the Black Student Union, co-signed as of yet by the Korean Student Union, Asian Student Union, Food Security Club, the Hilltopper newspaper, the newspaper, the Choose to Be Nice Club, and the Fundraising and Advocacy for Brazilian Communities Club. Thank you. You know, so there's thousands of interactions between the Needham Police and people around the town every year, and it's inevitable that some of these will be shaped by bias and preconceived prejudice that these officers have. And you know, all we can do is try to listen to the data experts and make it so less of these interactions result in problematic outcomes, even if they're inevitable. And thank you so much for showing up today, even in the cold when it's snowing. And it means a lot that even, you know, almost 2 years after the murder of George Floyd, when, you know, police reform is starting to wane in terms of its showing up in the news, and it means so much that everyone showed up today in the cold, even so long. So thank you so much.
So thank everyone who spoke before me. I'm so proud of so many people being here. I wish there were a lot more people here, you know. I feel anyone that put a Black Lives Matter sign on their lawn should be here, you know, because I think the people of color in our community need us more now, even more now, as this is starting to wane. I want to start just by talking about the police and say that, I mean, I think they have one of the toughest jobs, even in a town like Needham. They have to deal with lots of like the worst parts of society. They have to deal with lots of Karens. They have to deal with lots of Dougs, and you know that everyone knows the Dougs are the friggin' worst. And like people debate what they should be paid. I actually think we can't pay them enough. I think it's just a really important role. I say the same thing about teachers. But that job comes with tremendous power. And with that power can cause tremendous harm. And because of that, they can and should be held to the highest of standards. They have to be. So our oversight obviously has to be required from somewhere. It has to be. I will tell you, I mean, growing up in Needham, I mean, this is ancient history, but two of my closest friends growing up in high school were children of color, teens of color, and I saw how they were treated by police and around town, and their families moved because of that. I mean, I saw the worst possible treatment, and so different than how I was treated when I wasn't with them, you know, where I knew everything was going to be okay and there weren't going to be any problems. And I think throughout, people of color have just had a very different experience in this town, and we just need to be cognizant of it. My teenage sons are mixed race, but they present as white, but they have seen with their friends of color today treated very, very differently. When they're with police, they're going to be more likely to be stopped, asked where they're going, what are they doing, why are they here? That happens. It doesn't have to happen. Like I said, I saw it with my own friends growing up. I've heard it time and time again. I know families that have moved. Very close friends of ours that had two adopted children from Africa that left town because when their oldest was in middle school, what they saw already experiencing. And town leadership has never looked into it. I know they heard about it. They've never bothered to look into it. And EJN on their own dime had to pay the town to come up with the data. Finally looked at it and showed what I think we all knew was happening. If you're a person of color, you're more often to be stopped, you're more often to be written up, more often to be arrested. And it doesn't have to be that way. My brother-in-law, when he comes to visit, who, you know, I mean, my wife is Hispanic but presents as white, he has a darker skin. He was always stopped anytime he was walking around town and asked what he was doing and where he was going, where he's from. And there's no greater example than Mr. Henry. And I know that wouldn't happen to me. I know if I was at CVS that day and there was some other person with a very different body type and a very different outfit, there's no way I would have been stopped. If I had said I had a receipt, there's no way they would have cuffed me. So it's just a very different experience that literally only happened because of the color of his skin that day. And you know what? You know, all of us in our jobs, we make mistakes, right? Actually, I shouldn't admit this. I have my own business. I make tons of mistakes all the time. And you know what? Police are going to make mistakes, and boy, they made a boatload that day. And in the days that followed. And the town has made a ton of mistakes in the months that followed. I actually let them know that this incident happened, the select board, before Mr. Henry even came forward. Right after the George Floyd incident, when the town released a letter saying this will never happen in Needham. And all of those mistakes have caused tremendous harm. Tremendous harm to Marvin. Tremendous harm to our town. And I have yet to see any accountability for that. It was wrong. It was covered up. We were slow to exonerate him. And our internal review was a sham. How can we say with a straight face there was no bias that day? You know, and you know what? I have my own biases that I'm fighting with on a day-to-day basis. I think all of us have them, right? But whenever I hear someone say they have no biases, that's like the denial. You know, they have twice the problem of anyone else. And it was all bias that day. And unless we're honest about them, it's never going to get better. Our police leadership and our town leadership have done nothing to stop this from happening again. It will happen again. And that is what makes me the saddest and maddest of all. Thank you.
As Doug had mentioned, that we had gotten the town's own data from them and basically just published it and put it in a report so that we can all see what that is. So our town has, as Smriti was saying, taken some important steps. The NPD has hired a data analyst, and some data regarding race and policing has been shared publicly. A public safety report later this spring has been promised to provide data and analysis. And the chief of police has engaged with residents, and anti-bias training has been extended to all police officers. We hope that these steps will be sustained over the long term. Nevertheless, 2 years later, what we have not seen are the kinds of systemic reforms that Mr. Henry's lawsuit calls for, and that other towns in Massachusetts have been bold enough to move forward on. This past summer, our select board unfortunately voted down 3-2 a proposal to conduct a full and exhaustive independent expert review of all NPD policies and practices in order to benchmark them against best practices. They based this on a decision to wait until the post commission is rolled out later this year, even though post commissioners themselves are very clear that their work cannot substitute for the governance responsibilities of local authorities, and that local town governments can indeed go well beyond the basic minimums that the Post Commission proposes. We do hope the new Select Board will recognize the need for such a review. As VJ noted, we also seek the establishment of a Citizens Public Safety Committee in Needham to engage more deeply and directly with how to reimagine public safety in Needham. As part of that reimagining, we believe that Needham should join Amherst, Northampton, and Lynn, amongst other towns, in seriously considering alternative, unarmed first responder services to respond to the mental and behavioral health crises that are becoming an increasing share of emergencies in Needham. Our state senator, Rebecca Rausch, is one of the co-sponsors of the ACES Act, supported by the Massachusetts Public Health Association, which hopes to provide grant funding to support towns that wish to move forward with such a proposal. Mr. Henry has more than done his part to move us toward more equitable public safety in Needham. But the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights points out that while civil lawsuits may help deter police misconduct, success do not necessarily result in changes to police practices. And that's where we all come in. It's up to us to urge our government to do the hard and difficult work of creating a Needham that is safe and welcoming for all. And that's why 2 years later, I am also very excited to see us all here. I think it's very easy to just kind of move on. But we can't move on until things are better. And that's why we're here in the cold, because it's not, and it should be. So great to see you all.
I'm here as a citizen, as a member of our community, and being here with all of you and all the work that you've done to in part help move this town forward is greatly appreciated. And the concerns that so many of us have as people of color, as a black man in the town that we live in the world that we live in the state that we live in, is always warranted. And you don't want it to be that way. Growing up a black man in this world, when it comes to certain situations, worrying about where you are, worrying about what you're doing, what you say, what you're seen as, are things that kind of innately become a part of who you are as you grow up. As you're told by my family, by my mother, my grandmother, my parents, is that it's not good enough to just be good. You have to be great, borderline excellent, to do as much to make your mark in this world and to inspire change and to be that change that people want to see. So what I'm doing, as I speak for myself as an individual, is doing my best to help bring this town forward and to bring justice in all ways that are needed. And I know we have some work to do, and I know how important it is to never give up the fight. For all of you that are here, to continue to be, allies and advocates for all the people that are struggling in times of need, especially now. And to be here with all of you, I feel like it's a privilege and an honor, and to know that I'm not going to give up on this town and to right the things that we need to do to make our town better. And I will say, like Doug said earlier, there's a lot of people that have very important jobs, and everyone makes mistakes, and it's what you learn from them and how you decide to never make those mistakes again is what separates us for, I would say, insanity, doing those things over and over again. And the threat of being hurt, and being ridiculed, it's okay to go through it. It's okay to make those mistakes, but to reach out and have people to help pull you up and be a part of the change and the forward movement that we so greatly need in the world that we live in is not going to happen unless we do it together. And there's no change ever possible without the work of so many different individuals behind the scenes and in front of the scenes that are, doing their best. And sometimes it doesn't seem like their best is good enough, and that's true. We can always be better. And I stand here before you admitting that 1,000%. I know I can be better. I know we can be better as a town and as people. And we're not going to do that, like I said, unless we do it together. So I appreciate being here with all of you And I'm proud to be a Needham resident, and I'm sure all of you are as well. And let's continue. You know, it's going to take some time. We know things don't happen overnight, but just to, things are happening. They are happening. Things move slow, and I don't like that. As an individual, I don't like that at all. But I know there's progress being made. But aspirationally, I want to get to a time in a moment where I can say I'm 100% proud of everything we do from a diversity, equity, and inclusive process in the town of Needham. And I'm gonna do my best along with other people to make sure that we get there and we get to see that day. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate you all.
Being here, thank you for the invitation. I'm Rabbi Julie Bressler. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm just so grateful for all of you to be here and continuing the efforts to fight for change and equity in our town. I want to give a special shout out to VJ and your friends at the high school. With you as our next generation of leaders, I have faith that change will continue to happen. So thank you for all that you do. This week in our Torah portion, Jewish people around the world read about the important story of Yitro and the advice that Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, gives to his son-in-law. Moses himself is a very overwhelmed leader, but they talk about what it means to appoint other leaders in the town and who they should be. We learn that our leaders should be trustworthy, should be the highest of all of us. And that is what we hope. We know that our leaders have a very challenging job, but we hope that they always live to their highest ideals, to be the people that we all aspire to be the people that make our town the best place that it can be. And I also want to say that as today is the Jewish Sabbath, I also encourage all of us in our continued fights and efforts to remember to rest, to remember to take sacred pause, to give ourselves permission to take breaths, because this fight is long. These efforts continue, and only when we are our best selves can we continue that effort. So I invite us to draw from the wells that inspire us to take collective action to change the world around us. And as we are renewed, that is when we will act out of love and mutual solidarity. May we emerge after our sacred pauses, refreshed and ready to continue these efforts to build a world of peace and plenty, a world where all are treated with dignity, and a world of collective liberation where we all are able to thrive. And I close with words of prayer. Mishaberach Avotenu v'Imotenu, may the spirit of life who blessed our ancestors bless all of us. Bless us with the strength to continue our efforts to make Needham a welcoming place for all. May we continue to hold ourselves and our leaders accountable and build relationships that enable us to continue to hold the hard conversations, the necessary conversations that lead to change. Amen.
Thanks, Marvin. Freezing.
I was doing all right.
Thanks, Marvin. Freezing.
I was doing all